Maybe if you're new with us this morning or you've been here the last few weeks, we've been talking about this series of rest. We've been talking about what does it mean to have rest and to be a part of that. And it's kind of this opportunity in this moment where we get to kind of be a part of this idea of what does it look like in a world that is so defined by work and is so defined by achievement and activity. How do we just find a moment of rest in that? And for me, so me and my wife, we just got back from a week away at her family's lake house. It was a beautiful week, and then I just had a week where I was teaching up at a camp in Santa Cruz, and there's kind of this moment of like going, and a lot of stuff, and wasn't always physical rest, but then I found that moment of just a quiet time to get away a little bit, of just a little bit of spiritual and emotional rest, and just want to talk about that this morning of what is it that gives us rest? How do we rest together, and what does that look like? And so I want you guys to think about, Andrew and Katie kind of asked this question a little bit of how do you recharge? And then I want to pose that question again, and I want to pose it in a culture where I don't think 24/7 is even a thing anymore. I think it's 25/8, right? It's just, how do we do one up over everybody around us, and how do we get so much more done and accomplished and achieved, and what does it look like to just take a deep breath? And to just have a moment where we can just release that, and what for you is it that gives you rest? What is it for you where you can just inhale and exhale, and maybe it's for a brief moment, but what is it that gives you rest? I was kind of thinking, because again, we're talking about doing life around the tables, and before we fully jump into things this morning and the passage that I want to talk about of what it means to rest, I would love for us to spend a little time around tables talking about what is your ideal day of rest, okay? But this is how it's going to go. We're not all just going to like share, this is my full ideal day. We're each going to take a turn, and you each get a chance to insert one little part of that day, okay? So your table right now is like you have a day retreat, you can do whatever you want to, and your guys' job is to come with the best day that you could come up that was fun, it was with people, but is also restful and relaxing. And so take a moment, you each get like 20 seconds, right, to say what is your one thing you're going to insert into your perfect day as you as a table will get to rest. What would that look like? Okay, so I'm going to give you guys like 3 or so minutes to go around your table and share, each get one thing that you would add to your day of rest, whatever that would look like. And together, hopefully it'll be a restful day for your table, theoretically, but go do that, spend a little time. What would it look like? What is your one thing that you would insert into your perfect restful day? Spend a little time talking around tables. We'll jump back in here in a little bit. All right. Maybe those restful days are still being figured out. But as you guys are probably realizing as you're going around tables that everyone has a different idea of what rest is. Right? You probably heard someone say one thing and you're sitting to yourself thinking, that is not restful at all, but I really got to do that with them. Right? And some of you, like, you heard something, you're like, oh yes, like, amen, I am with you in that, right? I heard someone over here say, like, I have them get Postmates and bring it to my house and get like a meal delivered. Like, yes, like that sounds like a beautiful thing to just have to, it's the epitome, I feel like, sometimes of laziness, right? Of someone coming and bringing me food, but it's also a beautiful moment. And okay, this might be a little bit harder of a challenge. Okay, now what I want you guys to do is you all share a little bit of what your perfect restful day would be. If you were to try to find some consensus, I want to hear from kind of each table a little bit. What is the one thing that you guys can maybe agree upon? Like, okay, like we can agree that this would be kind of our restful thing. And so take 20 seconds each table. What is that like one thing for your table? You're like, oh yes, this was something we can agree upon that was restful for all of us. Okay. It sounds like, again, this is probably going to be hard to come up with some consensus of what restful was, but I want to hear some of these things, okay? And so if your table had a good one, we're just going to kind of shout them out. Yeah, Brody.
We've all agreed on tacos.
Tacos, okay. Yeah, tacos, restful, okay, yeah, Seth.
Our table likes alone time.
Alone time, yeah. Gotta get some like solitude alone time, so that was not restful, that whole experience, was it? What else? Couple more tables. Anything else you're like, yes, this is our moment. The beach, yes, the beach is always good. Anyone else want to throw something out? Last chance. Your restful thing is sleep. Thank you, Phil. Sleep without kids. Okay, yes.
Oh, that would be a good idea.
Get a babysitter. Yeah. No, I love it though, and I think as we talk about it, right, it's kind of fun to dream a little bit about rest and to have a moment here on a Sunday morning where we're sitting together and get to experience some rest too a little bit. And maybe though, as you're thinking about it, you're like, man, it sounds good to talk about it, but what if I can't actually experience that? Because if we're honest, right, there's still the demands of life, and there's still that go, go, go culture where we have to one-up the people next to us, and we have to get that promotion before the next person, and we have kids to come home to, and we have extracurriculars that we have to do, and then all of these things, and then that random person who hasn't talked to you in like a month is saying, hey, let's hang out again, and you're like, I don't have time for this, and it's nice to dream about rest, but is rest actually a reality? Is rest actually a reality? Is rest actually something that we can experience of going to the beach or eating tacos or sleeping or having a brief moment with you and your spouse or just you without kids running around? And what does rest actually look like? What if we could actually rest? And as we've been talking about the last couple weeks, and we talked about this idea of work and how do we make our work pleasing to God, and how do we do that well. We talked about last week of how do we have these moments of celebration in our life. Andrew talked about how in kind of this church calendar, right, in the days of God leading his people, how there was these scheduled times of celebration, these scheduled parties in life, to just have moments to just celebrate and have joy and release their joy and celebration. And today we want to kind of conclude this series of what does it like to rest? What does it look like to rest well and to create moments of rest? And this is something that I've wrestled with for several years because I've heard about it. Oh yeah, rest and Sabbath, and I should take a day to rest. And I was like, but I don't have time for that. And it sounds really cool on a Sunday morning in some put together talk, and yet Monday morning through Saturday it doesn't actually really work. And I've always wrestled with, man, what does it look like to actually rest and to experience Sabbath? And is this something that is actually important? And as I've been wrestling through this the last 3-4 years, and I've realized that, man, I think this is the most important thing. I think this is God's greatest gift to his creation, to humanity, to us. And I think Sabbath and I think rest is one of the things that God says, man, this is so important. And I want to bless you with it. And I want to challenge you with it. And so if you're thinking it's impossible to rest in a not even 24/7 culture, but a 25/8 culture of doing, I want you to take a deep breath. And I want you to be open to the fact that what if this is something that God has designed us for, is rest? If you guys have your Bibles, there's Bibles on the table. You can pull it up on your phone. The Wi-Fi is really bad in here, so good luck doing that, but you can try. And we're going to be in Exodus this morning. It's the second book of the Bible. It's at the beginning. And this is kind of the first time where God kind of commands his people to rest. And a little bit of just context here of where we're at kind of in this narrative of the Bible and this story of God's word, right? God has come and it says that he spoke the earth into existence and he created and it was good and years passed and it says that he chooses this guy named Abraham, and Abraham is going to be the father of this great nation, God's chosen people, and this nation of people gets put in slavery in Egypt, and God in his love says, hey, I want to rescue you and I want to bring you out of that. And so he brings the people of Israel out of the nation in slavery in Egypt, and he says, you're going to be my people. And this dude named Moses is kind of the guy who's the leader, and he's leading them and commanding them and directing them, and he's pointing them towards who God is. And as God is speaking to Moses and Moses speaking to the people, God says, I want to give you an identity. I want to make you a people. And as any group of people goes, right, there's different laws and different things that set you apart and make you who you are. And in Exodus chapter 20, where we're going to be at this morning, is where God gives the nation of Israel, his chosen people, the 10 Commandments. We've probably all heard of the 10 Commandments, yeah? Walked in the courthouse, maybe you've seen them up there, right? And it's kind of one of those things where there's at least this cultural reference of the 10 Commandments. You've heard of that at some point, I'm sure, in some point in life. Well, this is the moment where God first gives the 10 Commandments, this whatever those mean to the people. And I always think it's funny because it's something that we all kind of know and yet probably don't know. I was in a class a few years back, and my teacher said, hey, can you list out the 10 Commandments? It's like, don't even worry about putting them in order, but can you just get 10 of them down on the page? And I got like 3 or 4 maybe of like, I know you're not supposed to murder people. I think that's in there, and don't covet, right? But like, how many of us actually know the 10 Commandments? Don't feel bad if you don't, because I probably didn't until I looked them up earlier, okay? But this is where God gives these commandments to the people that are to lead the people and to guide the people. I'll put them up on the screen so that you can test yourself and see if you actually knew them all. Here's the 10 Commandments, and they're kind of simplified, but in Exodus chapter 20, this is where God speaks to Moses and he begins to give these commandments to the people. You can follow along if you want, or just glance up at the screen and see it summarized. The Lord says to Moses, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt in slavery. And then he goes on to this list of the Ten Commandments. He says, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself carved images. It says, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain, skipping down to verse 7. And then it gets to verse 8 and it says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. I want to kind of break this down. I want to look at what the Lord says here, what God says about the Sabbath. But just so I don't skip over, right after he talks about the Sabbath, then down in verse 12 he says, also honor your father and mother. Verse 30 says, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, and you shall not covet, right? These are these kind of 10 rules and these 10 laws that God gives to people. And as you look at them up there, I've never really thought about it, but there's kind of a specific order to these different commandments. Right? If you look at the first 3 commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. And so God says, hey, I am the one true God, and I don't want you to worship any other gods. I don't want you to be drawn and pulled aside to these other nations who are worshiping other things, because I am the one true God, and I want you to have life and experience a relationship with me. And he says, don't have any other gods before me. He says, don't have any graven images. Don't have these little idols that you hold up and represent me or take the place of me in your life. And today, right, that might be don't have any other Netflix accounts or Hulu accounts or Instagram accounts that are higher than me, right? And it doesn't mean we don't have them, but it just means, like, are you worshiping other things? And God says, hey, like, don't worship other things. Like, I am the one true God who is above all of these things. The third commandment, right, is do not take the Lord's name in vain. Don't take who God is lightly. And all 3 of these are directed to who God is. They're all commands that are designed to help us better love God. Right, remember, fast forwarding a little bit, when Jesus comes, the Son of God, he says the greatest commandment is love God and love others. These first 3 commandments are all about loving God to the fullest. And so God gives these commands to the people, say, hey, like, if you want to love me well, like I have called you to do, this is what you do, is you make me the top priority of your life. And then there's the Sabbath, and we're going to skip over that real quickly. And then there's these last 6 commands. And all of these, if you notice, are all actually directed at other people. They're not about God, they're about living amongst other people and how to live amongst other people well. It's about loving your parents well. It's about not murdering. That's a pretty good one. If you're going to love someone, probably don't end their life, right? And all of the other ones up there, do not steal, do not commit adultery. See, I have to look at them too because I don't even know them all, right? And do not covet. These things are designed to live well with other people, to love other people well. And so in these lists of 10 commandments, right, there's the first half is kind of talking about, the first section is talking about how do we love God really well. The second half is talking about how do we love people really well. And then there's this 4th commandment in there, and it's kind of this bridge between the 2. And God says, keep the Sabbath day holy. Keep your day of rest holy. And I find it fascinating that the Sabbath, this day of rest, is this intersection between how we love God well and how we love people well. And it's this beautiful gift, and it's this beautiful command, and it's the only commandment that's actually directed towards ourselves in a sense. It's the only commandment that's this bridge between loving God and loving others, and in the middle it says, but you have to have this intersection point where you allow yourself the space to love God well and love others well. I just find that, like, so cool. Like, the Sabbath is like this pinnacle hinge point of loving God and loving people. And let's jump back into Exodus and see what God says about the Sabbath. Out of all the commandments listed here, this is the one that has the biggest explanation. Maybe there's something there, probably is, right? Verse 8, the Lord says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, neither your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Right, so the longest explanation of any of these commands God gives for the Sabbath here, and I think it's just a couple really cool things that the Lord points out here, and a couple cool things that I think is important to note. Is first, you might have noticed the inclusion in keeping the Sabbath. It's the one command that talks about sons and daughters, and male and female and servants, and it talks about even the animals, like the animals need rest too, and it talks about the livestock, and then it also talks about the foreigner, the outcast, the person on the margins who's a part of their society, that this applies to them too. Like, this is the one command that applies to everything. It's not just the people of God who's God saying, hey, like, you're my people, you worship me above all else, but he's saying everyone who's in your midst, even the foreigner, and even the slave, and even the person you've captured from that battle and now is serving you, even that person gets a Sabbath day. Even that person gets a moment of rest. Notice the inclusion in the Sabbath here. It's all inclusive. It's like that buffet you really want to go to because everything's included, right? It's like the Sabbath is for everyone. It's also the only command here in these 10 Commandments where God actually gives an example of him practicing. God actually says, hey, like, I did this, and if I created everything and I rested, like, maybe I did that for a purpose. He says, I want you to look to my example, that I created everything and didn't need a rest because I'm God and I'm fully capable of not resting, and yet I took a rest day to show you rest is important. Taking a deep breath is important. And I love that in these commandments that God gives to his people, he says, I want you to thrive, I want you to be successful, I want you to love God well, and I want you to love people well, but to do that, you have to take a deep breath. You have to have a day of rest. This is a theme that's continued throughout the Old Testament, and you see the people continuing their Sabbath day, and it's the one thing that set them apart in that culture. They're kind of the one people group back in ancient Near Eastern culture that took a rest day, and people often thought, why are they taking a rest day, right? But it was the one thing that set them apart, and the Israelites continued as they moved into the promised land God had given them. They kept their Sabbath day, and as the judges came and ruled the land, they kept their Sabbath day, and it talks about it in the book of Judges, and it talks about it in the Samuel and 2 Samuel, and this history of Israel. And when the kings came and the kings ruled Israel, it talks about they keep their Sabbath day, and King Saul and King David and King Solomon, and they incorporated Sabbath day into who they are. And eventually the nation of Israel gets captured and gets taken over, and they're put in exile, right? And they're in a far-off country, and it talks about that they still keep their Sabbath day. People think that this is probably one of the main reasons why Israel stayed together as a people group, because they held on to the Sabbath, because it gave them a sense of identity and purpose, because it was rooted in the core of who they were. Right? And then Jesus comes, the Son of God, to this world, and he lives amongst the people, and he says, I want you to know who God is, and I want you to be able to love God fully and love people fully. And he talks about the Sabbath time and time and time and time again. In the Gospels, which talk about Jesus' life, 50 times it's mentioned in these 4 books of the Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath holy, and Jesus teaching on Sabbath. And Jesus redefines Sabbath. It's not so much about the rules and the regulations, but it's about a deep breath of resting with God. It wasn't about, hey, you can't even walk a certain number of steps each day, and they narrowed it down to this perfect little box that you were so confined that you couldn't do anything, and everything was considered work, and you couldn't even feed your livestock, and you couldn't even feed your animals, and if your sheep fell in the well, you couldn't pull them up and save them because that was considered work. And Jesus comes and says, no, that's not the point of Sabbath. The point of Sabbath is to rest and to remember who God is, and to remember you're called to love people. And more than any other commandment, Jesus talks about the Sabbath when he's teaching the people. I don't think that's a mistake. Right? The early church, as Jesus ascends into heaven, he's killed on the cross, and he's crucified, but then he's risen again, and there's this victory, and he says, I want you to be my people, and I want you to know God. And he says to the people, hey, I want you to carry on these things you've learned. And the early churches, the churches started, and this Jesus movement has started, they hold on to Sabbath, and they keep the Sabbath day, and they remember who Jesus is. Take a deep breath. Rest. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I get so it's cool, it just transcends throughout culture. And in the 4th and 5th century, this dude named Augustine is this really smart guy, and he probably said that they just called him dude, and he's kind of provided so much context for the church. He says this about Sabbath. He says, "Oh Lord, you who have made us, and our spirits are restless until we rest in you." Centuries later, the Sabbath is key to who they are. Martin Luther, this guy who in the 15th century, right, in the 1500s, and kind of this time of the Reformation, as the church is changing and the church is shifting, and one of these fathers who says it's about loving Jesus and loving God and giving that to the people. And this is what he says about the Sabbath, he says, spiritual rest, which God especially intends, is that we are not only to cease from our labor and our work and our trade, but much more. That we let God alone work in us, and that in all our powers do we do nothing of our own, but through God, and so we rest. And so I was thinking about how this idea of Sabbath and rest has transcended from the beginning of time until now, and I asked the question, well, is it actually important now? Do I actually need Sabbath rest? Do I actually need the fourth commandment? Or is this something that's like, yeah, it could be cool if you have time for it? And so I was looking a little bit more scientifically. I was a biology major in college, and so I love just looking at like the human body and anatomy and how the body works. And I was reading this study that was done about 10 or so years back. And it was done with this guy by the name of Juan Carlos Learman at the University of Arizona. And he basically did this study of people who worked 7 days a week and worked long hours versus people who chose to take one rest day. And so he kind of did these two blind studies and had a kind of study in the middle to kind of just see what is the effect of resting versus not resting. And after 100 days of kind of doing this study and doing this research, the University of Arizona and this guy who was conducting this found out that those who failed to take a rest day and who worked 7 days a week and didn't take one day off, that it led to greater levels of insomnia, to sleeplessness, to hormonal imbalance in their body. They could actually measure the hormonal level differences in their body. They had a greater level of fatigue. They were more irritable, and they had organ stress, right? And so they're measuring all these things just over 100 days of people who worked 7 days versus taking the rest day. And so this guy started thinking, he was doing this study, like, why is that, right? And so he's looking into anatomy, he's looking into the human body, and as they find out that the human body cycle and the biological clock is about a 25-hour cycle. We live on 24-hour cycles, right? Our day is 24 hours, and they found that what the human body does is it actually functions better on a 25-hour cycle. With our circadian rhythms and the time we go to sleep and the time we wake up and all of this stuff is compiled into a 25-hour cycle. And obviously, as we only live 24 hours, that leaves this like gap each week where we aren't able to make that up. And so what he found biologically is that because of the way that our body is wired and on this 25-hour cycle, and that's how we rejuvenate, and that's how our cells regenerate, and that's how we find rest, is that when the people who took a rest day, they found better levels of less fatigue and less stress and better organ health and better hormonal balance in their body, was because they gave themselves a day to regenerate on this 25-hour a day cycle. And so it's like hardwired into our DNA and how we like work and how we live and how we breathe that we need rest to function better. We physically need rest to be actually more productive, and when we take a moment to rest, that we can actually do our work better and we can do our work more fully, and we can live into who we're supposed to be. And so as I look at this and I see the trajectory of rest and of Sabbath, and I see biologically how our bodies are created for rest, and then I ask the question again, well, how do I rest, and what does that look like, and can I actually find physical rest? And I want to pose the question to us this morning, like I did at the very beginning, of how do you rest, and maybe changing that, do you rest? And I think keeping the Sabbath holy is something we have to fight for. Because it's not natural. Because it's countercultural. Because it goes against every fiber of our being to be the best and to be the greatest and to take control of our life and to level up to the next promotion and to having another kid and to having everything put together and to whatever it may be. But what would it look like to keep the Sabbath and make it holy? To recognize that God has created us for rest. And I could give you all the scientific facts of how rest actually improves your productivity, and those who rest actually work better, and trajectory shows and studies have shown that those who take a rest day and the Sabbath day are actually promoted. Oh, that's going down. Are actually promoted more, and all of these things, how rest is actually beneficial for us. And I want to touch on the physical appeal to rest, but I also want to talk about the emotional aspects that rest brings. So we allow ourselves the moment to just take a deep breath and to rest physically. We're able to be restored emotionally. That oftentimes when so much is going on the surface, we never have a chance to look internally at ourselves. And when we take that moment to rest, not only are we restored physically, but emotionally we begin to be restored, and we have more patience, and we have more ability to process through where we're actually at and what we're actually doing, and in that we're living in an area of health. And so yes, there's physical benefits to resting, and we can talk about things, but there's also this emotional benefit to resting when we allow ourselves to take a deep breath emotionally and ask, how am I actually doing? What is going on below the surface? And in that, in health, being able to love God better and love people better because I'm attending to myself as God has designed me for. And so there's physical rest and there's emotional rest, but there's also spiritual rest that comes through the idea of Sabbath. One author says it this way, and it hit me and it convicted me. It says, on the Sabbath day, we deliberately remember that we have ceased trying to be God and instead have put our lives back in God's control. On our Sabbath day, when we deliberately take the chance to cease from trying to be God in our own lives, when we say, okay, yeah, I would love to work and I have more work to do to get this project done and get this deadline done, and instead of saying, okay, God, but I'm not in control of my life. God, you are in control of my life. And in that moment, we're saying, I'm no longer the God of my own life, but I am trusting the creator of the universe to be God. I put God back in the place of saying, okay, God, I trust you, and I lean into you. I trust that you're going to give me the time. I trust that you're going to give me the energy, and we relinquish that control, and we're able to follow those first 3 commands of having no other gods before the one true God. And that includes myself. And so Sabbath rest gives us the chance to realign ourselves spiritually. This bridge between loving God and loving others that God has given us and gifted us. And so I want to challenge us to think about what would it look like for you to incorporate rest into your life. To incorporate rest into your rhythm of work. And maybe it's one of those things where you say, I don't know if I can commit a full day because there's a lot on my plate right now. And maybe it's you find seasons of rest in your life. Maybe it's far off the road and you say, I don't have the time to take a weekend away, but I'm going to put it on the calendar and I'm going to shoot for that. And that means I'm going to have to work really hard and work extra to get there. And yet, what if it gives you this chance to have a light at the end of the tunnel? What if you say, man, instead of just watching one extra episode of, me and my wife, we're stuck in The Flash right now, it's such a good show. And we watch too many episodes of it, and it's like at night before bed, it's like, okay, we should just go to bed, but it's a cliffhanger, let's watch one more. What if I just turned it off one episode earlier and took a moment to exhale? And find rest in that moment instead of having my mind just go crazy, my synapses going from all of this visual stimulation, and just actually be able to rest my mind and have a better night's sleep because I was disciplined enough to say, okay, I can push a power button. Maybe it's not a full day of rest for you, but maybe it's getting up 5 minutes earlier and just practicing your breathing and breathing slowly before the day starts. Thank you for that breath, God. Thank you for that breath, God. And then starting your day. What would it look like for you to incorporate rest into your schedule? I was starting grad school 4 years ago, and my very first class, we talked about Sabbath and we talked about rest. And unfortunate for me, my professor had done his dissertation on Sabbath and had just written a book on Sabbath, and so this is all we talked about. And at the beginning, he challenged us with some of these things, and he said, do you trust God enough to rest? He said, I just want you 1 week this semester, you have 16 weeks, I want you to have 1 week where you don't do any work for a day. Where you turn off your phone, where you avoid your shoulds and your oughts of I should do this, I ought to do that. You say, just take a day and go. Do what gives you life. Go eat tacos. Go to the beach. And just do that for a day. And this was a season in my life I was taking about 13 grad school units, which they say a grad school unit is about 4 hours of work, so that equates to 52 hours a week that I should have been doing school. Probably didn't, but 52 hours a week of just school alone. I was working 2 part-time jobs. I was working as an after-school teacher teaching computer coding and chess to elementary school kids, and I was working as a maintenance technician at my school, and glorified way of saying I plunged toilets and fixed dishwashers, right? And at the same time, I was a part of this church plant up in Claremont area, and I was helping them out on the weekends, and so there was just no time for rest. Like, that alone was probably like 70 or so hours, and then also trying to help this church get off the ground. And I was swamped, and I was drowned, and I was learning about the Sabbath, and I was saying, that sounds great, and I love that God commanded it, and I love that it's this bridge between loving God and loving people, but I don't have time for it. Like, life will not allow for me to have a Sabbath day. And my professor said, Jordan, what if you trusted God enough to take a Sabbath day? And I said, Dr. Mathai, I don't have time for that. You don't understand. He said, Jordan, trust God. And so I set up this week where I was going to do it, and I worked extra hard all week to get all my assignments done and all my reading done. And I wrote my song set and my worship set before church that Sunday so I could just show up and not have to spend all Saturday prepping. And I turned off my phone Friday night, and I just spent a day of rest. And it was hard, and it was hard to shut down my brain, and it was hard to rest, and it was hard to not think about the to-do list. And yet I found that whole week leading up to it, that I was way more productive because I had something to look forward to. And the whole next week I was way more energized because I had taken a day to attend to myself, and I could actually love God, and I could actually love people. And I said, man, what if I actually did this in my life consistently? And in a semester of life when it didn't make sense, I said, I'm going to commit to this. And for me, it's Fridays. I tell Andrew Case that I'm not going to respond on Fridays. Like, I have Fridays off. Like, I'm sorry if you have to reach me. Like, and I take Fridays off because I realize that rest is important. That God has biologically designed us for rest. That God has physically designed us for rest. That God has spiritually and emotionally said, I want you to rest. And I have given this as a gift to you. Will you trust me enough to take a deep breath? And I don't want to give you this formula of what rest looks like and how to practice that this week, but I want to challenge you with thinking about what would rest look like in your life. What would it look like to rest together, communally, encouraging each other to rest, to finding joy in friendship? What would it look like to rest and getting moments away where we're by ourselves and we can reflect and we can ask how we're actually doing, and to pause and to acknowledge that God is the God of our life, that He is in control. I'm going to have the worship team come up. And we're going to continue in our service. And for those of you who have been here, you know we have some songs. We have a time of taking communion where we acknowledge and we remember who Jesus is. And sorry about your microphone. And we sing songs and we're together. And I just want to kind of direct this time a little bit. I want this to be this moment where we can experience rest, where we can exhale. And if you're cool with it, and if you're comfortable with it, just take your phone and hold the button down for however many seconds it takes to get the power button to go, and just turn your phone off. You can do it. It's okay. If that's too much, just put it on airplane mode, and if that's too much, just silence it. It's that little moon button that makes it sleep, and be free from that for the next 10, 15 minutes of service. As the band is playing for a little bit, they're just going to kind of play in the background, and just maybe it's a moment where you just take some deep breaths, where you think about physically your lungs filling and the air coming out of your lungs. Maybe you pick up a pen and you just start doodling because that clears your mind and that gives you rest, and do that. Maybe you just close your eyes and you doze off a little bit, and hey, that's okay. Maybe you just look around and you say, man, I love people so much, and you just look at the people in this room and you say, man, I can't wait to share with them and to talk with them after, and you just picture what that's like to be with people, and you find rest in that. And as the band plays and as the music is in the background, remember that God has made the Sabbath for you. That God has made a rest for us as a gift so that we can better love God and love people. And to do that, we need to take time to rest. After
a little bit, the band will play a few worship songs, and if you want to enter into that time, it's also a time where we're going to take our communion. It's in the back table back there, and there's bread and baskets, and there's cups of juice, and if you're ready, and when you're ready, you can just get a piece of that bread, and you can dip it in the juice, and as this reminder of Jesus and his love and his ability to give everything for us, because he said, I love you and I care about you, and I care about you enough to bless you with rest. And so when you're ready, you can get up at any point in these next few songs and take communion and come back to your seat. But let this be a time of rest as we continue our service, resting together as we sing and individually as we meet with God. Jesus, I thank you for your love, for your